Greetings, philosophy of science. So today we're going to talk about Paul Thagard's article regarding pseudoscience. Why is astrology a pseudoscience, right? And Thagard starts out by rejecting some possible reasons why astrology is a pseudoscience, that is to say, a fake science, right? It's been offered up a possible objection to astrology. Well, look, astrology is owes its origins to magic, right? Magical studies, and that means that it can't possibly be a science. Well, as Thagard points out, chemistry and medicine both began in magic as well. So if we're going to discount astrology on those grounds, we have to discount obviously chemistry and medicine. So okay, well, um, what about testing or verification or falsification, right? You can't test or verify or falsify any astrological predictions, right? But as Thagard notes, some astrological claims, right, about the influence of planetary positions at the time of one's birth on one's personality and future career are testable, right? And also, it should be noted, gang, if you're going to dismiss a purported science because its results aren't testable, then that means evolutionary theory is out because we got no way to test that those predictions either. As a matter of fact, by and large, evolutionary biologists don't try to make predictions about what kind of mutations will come down the line. So this leads to a really interesting point that Thagard has to make. If you look at every major science, physics, chemistry, biology, all of them have slight little problems, right? That they don't fit the canonical, if you will, conception of what makes a science, right? So this leads Thagard to formulate a new definition of what he considers a pseudoscience. So he defines it thusly: a theory or discipline which purports to be scientific is pseudoscientific if and only if, and he lists two conditions. One, it has been less progressive than alternative theories over a long period of time and faces many unsolved problems. But two, the community of practitioners makes little attempt to develop the theory towards solutions of the problems, shows no concern for attempts to evaluate the theory in relation to others, and is selective in considering confirmations and disconfirmations. So according to these conditions, astrology is pseudoscientific in part because it has not changed much since the time of Ptolemy. And Ptolemy was a ancient Roman astronomer. Unsolved problems have accumulated, and as Thagard notes, we now have, since the 19th century, psychological theories that do a better job of explaining and predicting human behavior, right? And despite this competition from psychology, astrologers have shown little interest in improving their theory or in evaluating it with respect to rivals, right? Well, there are a couple of responses to Thagard, right? One is that one might view the acceptability of consequences as a measure of the plausibility of his proposal, right? So some current fads, such as pyramidology and biorhythms, would not be considered pseudosciences because at the moment they lack serious competitors, right? Second, a theory can be scientific at one time and pseudoscientific at another time. And a good historical example of this, and fairly recently, right? You go back to the 19th century when phrenology, if any of you have seen Django Unchained, you'll remember that what's his name? Leonardo DiCaprio, his character appealed to phrenology. It was a study of the shape of one's skull in an attempt to predict criminal behavior. It was a very serious science, and in the mid 19th century, nobody puts any stock in it today. Third, Thagard concludes that astrology used to be a genuine science, but became pseudoscientific only when modern psychology arose in the late 19th century. If this is correct, then those scientists, the vast majority who rejected astrology as pseudoscientific in the 18th century, and many did, most of them did, Newton, for example, were being irrational, right? So given this, Thagard later, in 1988, he changed his views on pseudoscience, right? In his book, Computational Philosophy of Science, he gives up trying to provide necessary and sufficient conditions for pseudoscience. Instead, he offers contrasting profiles of genuine science and pseudoscience. Relative progressiveness and a concern with confirmation and disconfirmation are still presented as hallmarks of science, right? And their absence is still associated with pseudoscience. But Thagard no longer claims that science must always possess these features or that pseudoscience must necessarily lack them. Thagard also introduces two new criteria for pseudoscience. One of these criteria is that pseudoscientific theories are often highly complex and riddled with ad hoc hypotheses. So let's take a minute to talk about ad hoc hypothesis. Ad hoc means with this in Latin, right? And so what happens when you add an ad hoc hypothesis is you're trying to patch holes, right, on the fly, so to speak, right? The theory has serious problems, and you come up with a just so story to try to mend it. And the more this happens, so a good example of this, Ptolemy's model of the universe was flawed, and astronomers in the ancient world recognized this right off the bat. Now, there's something wrong about this, right? So what they did is they invented something called epicycles. So instead of planets making, perfectly circular, the ancients believed that planets made entirely circular orbits, right? But when they did that, they noticed that their measurements were off. So what they did is they came up with an ad hoc hypothesis, which was epicycles. So they made this notion that the planets were moving in little loops as they were making their larger circle around the sun. That's a great example of an ad hoc hypothesis, right? This provides some grounds for judging a doctrine pseudoscientific on its content, even if it currently has no scientific competitors. Thagard's second new criterion concerns the sort of reasoning employed by many practitioners of pseudoscience, such as astrologers, namely reasoning based on resemblances. Now, gang, I do not want you to come away with the idea that arguments from analogy are not useful. Our arguments from analogy are absolutely vital to human understanding of anything, because arguments from analogy enable us to explain the unfamiliar in terms of the familiar. We bottom line can't dispense with them. But what Thagard is arguing here is that we need to move beyond appearances and look at statistical analysis. That's what really, on his view, separates the wheat from the chaff, so to speak. A pseudoscience will not offer up statistical analysis, right? Now, regarding this entire demarcation criterion debate, you should know that in the last 20 years, scientists and philosophers of science generally have kind of given up on establishing a demarcation criterion, what separates science from pseudoscience. And it's a lot like this debate, again, argument from analogy, right? It's very similar to one that's going on in art. What separates art from all other human cultural endeavors? And as it turns out, it's virtually impossible to find any criterion, right? So just know that this debate, it's not as important to the enterprise of science now as it was, say, 25, 30 years ago.